Welcome, everyone, to episode 30 of Making Sense, a Eurodollar University production. My name is Emil Kalinowski. I am joined by Jeff. I'm not in my environment, right? I'm in a different environment. I don't know exactly how to introduce you. Jeff Snider, Head of Global Research for Alhambra Investments.
Well, Emil, I think as I learned last time, I'm supposed to say you've left me speechless. So with this introduction, you've left me speechless, and I don't know what to say either.
Thank you very much, Jeff. I appreciate that. It's very kind of you to say. All right, well, let's tell the audience, why are they listening today? Today, we're going to go over 3 articles, as we usually do with Jeff's writing. And the first set of articles, we're going to combine 2 articles in the part 1. And part 1 is going to be all about the employment situation in the United States of America. We'll see if we can branch out a little bit and talk about some other countries, because I've got some notes here about that. But the main point is, of course, the employment situation translates into consumption. And for the global audience that's watching us, the world's largest consumer is the American. So how is the employment situation in the United States? Let's check in. Jeff, we're going to start with an article that's called "What's Job Cuts Got to Do with It? Everything." And you wrote it a week ago. So based on the payroll numbers that were coming out a week ago, is that right?
Yeah, there's the payroll numbers a week ago and some other related data that's come out since then that really there's kind of a split narrative about what's going on in the employment situation. One is that it's really good and things are really positive, but yet then there's all these contradictory information that says, hang on a second here, we don't really know the full complete story yet. We haven't seen all of the underlying conditions for being revealed from what is essentially a massive mess, and trying to sort out what's happened since that mess took place.
And you sort of set the scene at the beginning of the article by talking about what Q1 was, what Q2 was, and Q3, and now that we're entering into Q4. Can you set the scene again, just for anyone that's come from Mars and is checking in, or just people who are living lives and they're not following the macroeconomic details day to day, but kind of where were we in Q1, Q2, Q3, and now heading into Q4 regarding what expectations were for employment?
And not just the economy overall, right? I mean, Q2 was the big quarter. That was where everything went wrong and everything went bad. And as weird as as it sounds to say, Q2 almost didn't matter, because we all knew it was going to be bad. It was going to be the worst. It was going to be devastating, all that stuff. And in the same sense, Q3 didn't really matter either, because as soon as they started opening things up back in May, so you had May and June, which were part of the awful Q2 quarter, and then we got into Q3. So Q3 was always going to be a really good one. So you had this really bad one and a really good one. And the question is whether the good one canceled out the bad one, or the good one not good enough to leave some of the bad still lingering. And all of those issues would start to get sorted out in Q4. Q4 is really where it starts to matter. And I really think it's next year before we see all of the full extent of what has happened this year. It won't become clear until next year. But the narrative has always been, look, hey, it's really easy here. We shut everything down at the flip of a switch. We'll just we'll flip the switch back on, and the economy will come roaring back to life. And that's really that was the predominant narrative about, the V-shaped recovery. It was just that easy. And oh, by the way, the government and the Federal Reserve and all the central banks around the world were going to throw all of their massive resources into the mix too, and that would guarantee that it was just as easy as flipping a switch. We flipped it off and we flipped it right back on. So by the time we get to Q4, we're back to even again. And that was the idea.
And you said in your article, quote, "We aren't quite there yet, but it does seem uncomfortably close." So just as you said, you don't think it might be Q4, the thing that you're looking for, but you just told us maybe at the start of next year. But what is uncomfortably close? What are you looking for?
Well, looking for deficit, right? If Q2 is the big downturn and Q3 was the comeback, did Q3 make up for Q2? What happened in the third quarter make up for what happened in the second quarter? And what we keep seeing is no. it didn't even come close. I mean, yeah, the numbers were massive, especially the payroll numbers. They're, positive by millions. And go back to the May payroll report. Remember, that was the surprisingly positive one. It was something like plus $1.5 million, and it was supposed to be minus $8 million. So it was like a $10 million or 10 million payroll difference. And it was this, oh my God, the economy's really, it played right into that narrative that it really is this easy to turn everything right back on. And then we go through the summer, and all of a sudden we start seeing some concerning things where not only is it, that kind of masked underlying negativity and negative factors still going in the labor market, but also we have this post-July kind of hangover, slowdown, potential rollover, inflection, whatever you want to call it, where not only are we short of getting back to where we were previously, the lack of V is already slowing down before we even get to Q4. In fact, in the middle of the third quarter, we started to see slowdown. And we not only see it in a broad section of economic data, we see it right in the labor market itself.
I'm going to read a quote back to you about another party that's very much involved in following what's happening with the employment picture in the United States. And let's see if you remember who this person is. Quote, "We are setting new records for job cuts, even though things have improved since the earliest days of the pandemic." Who said that, and why is that important?
Wasn't that Andrew Challenger, the owner or president of the eponymous Challenger Gray labor market data people? Who most famously, I think they're most well known for keeping track of, as they said, job cuts in the labor market, announcements and actual, what companies are planning on cutting and how much they actually have cut. And I think that's really the hangover part of the reopening was, okay, a lot of companies were really hit and they were really damaged by that downdraft in Q2, and they only got, they partially made up for it in Q3, but then they were kind of hanging on, hanging in there, hoping that this V-shaped narrative actually becomes V-shaped reality, not laying off as many workers as they probably should have, given the level, the lower level of revenue coming into their firms. And so there was always that potential that if the V doesn't develop quickly enough, it doesn't go back to, doesn't get us back to close to a normal again, there'd be another round of bloodletting, because companies that were hanging on, hoping for full recovery very quickly, the flip of a switch, realize that, it's not a flip of a switch. This is a longer term problem. I need to start reorienting my own business to this different reality than what I've been expecting for the last 6 months. And that's what the Challenger data is starting to show, is that some of these companies are saying, look, we've been hanging in for 6 months thinking the V is going to happen, but since the summertime, we're starting to get a little bit nervous, and we're going to start thinking ahead toward really doing some more towards balancing our revenues and costs.
That's right. And so we have a few data points that can confirm your concerns. We have, as we just discussed, the Challenger Gray comments, but just a few days before that, in Spain, the government extended their national furlough program to January of 2021. And in Britain, their furlough program is ending at the end of October. And I will eat something, whatever. I'm not wearing a hat, but if I had a hat, I'd eat it, that they will also extend their furlough program. France has already extended their furlough program to 2022. Can you imagine, Jeff? So they did it before, but I'm sure that Spain, Britain is seeing something in their data causing them to think about or actually extend their furlough programs. And I think we're seeing something similar in the United States. And you brought that up in this article with the Bureau of Economic Analysis and personal income. And Jeff, I'm looking at it, if I'm looking at it or hearing about it from CNBC, I'm told that personal income is higher in August than it was in March. Home run, game over, free, wonderful. That's better, right? Good.
And that's true. It's absolutely true. The personal income goes up, but it's why personal income goes up and from what source. And the answer is that it's government payments. So the government has paid more out than the deficit in income has produced. But as we know throughout history, and economic history in particular, that consumers respond to, again, the permanent income hypothesis, which is essentially, if you get a short-term windfall, you're going to view it very different than a permanent income stream from labor and work. And what we've seen is exactly the opposite. The government, as you pointed out, not just in the US, but across the world, sees this private shortfall in income and labor, or income from labor, and is saying, we need to do something about that because we don't think it's going to come back anytime soon. In fact, income from private sources, especially income from labor, since March hasn't come back much at all. In fact, nowhere near what we would expect, given the idea that it was easy to turn this stuff back on. And the furlough programs you mentioned, Emil, are essentially, I think, government's starting to cater to this reality that it wasn't as easy as flipping a switch. And I think everybody hoped that it was. And it was almost like a fingers crossed strategy, right? It was like, maybe we can just get back to work and everything. We'll just reopen everything and everything just goes right back to normal. We hope that's the case. But now over the summer, reality is setting in that was never going to be the case. And now what do we do about it? What do we do about it? One of the things governments do is they simply throw money at it. But just throwing money at it through furlough programs, unemployment payments, or even the helicopter payments we got in the United States isn't the same thing as labor income. It's just not. And that's why you see, yes, spending has come back more than income has, but that's government payments. But it hasn't come all the way back either. And the way a lot of businesses are responding to this spending is they're viewing it as artificial too, which is why they're not investing. So we have this economic shortfall that for the last 6 months has been sort of papered over by cash from the government, but it still hasn't produced the V-shaped narrative, at least the original V-shaped narrative, and it's leading us into a second kind of narrative.
And in your article, and the graph that I'm showing it right now for our YouTube audience is of personal income and spending, as you were just talking about. That's the key that translates into the global economy. And you show 3 lines. The first one is personal income nominal, and that includes the government stipends, not stimulus, as you say, stipends. And then we see real personal income excluding those transfer receipts and real personal consumption expenditures. And the problem is, as you write in this article, the problem is that the consumption, if we're interested in economic activity, the consumption resembles real personal income excluding transfer receipts. Does that mean, Jeff, that these stipends, they're being saved rather than spent? They're not really stimulus.
Right. And that's kind of what you see throughout economic history. Whenever these kinds of stipends show up, that's really how consumers, they react to the stipends as a windfall, right? It's, if things were good, I'm sure they would spend them, but it's kind of contrary. It's almost a paradox that when things are bad, they tend to save them because things are bad, right? That's rational behavior. And that's really the point here. It's not stimulus because the government stipends don't change the underlying perception of the economic reality. And consumers draw their perceptions of economic reality from the labor market. And that's rational behavior too. It doesn't matter how much stipend the government pays you. I want to know if I'm going to have a job in a year. And if I'm even a little bit concerned I don't have a job in a year, I'm going to save as much money as I can because that's a real possibility now. It doesn't even matter if I'm never laid off. So long as I perceive that there's some significant level of uncertainty in the labor market, that's what I'm going to do. And it's rational behavior. And it's nothing the government can do to overcome that kind of rational behavior because the economy itself, the private underlying economy itself, is what matters. And everything that we're seeing from the labor market data to job cuts and everything else, even jobless claims, what they're showing is that consumers have every reason to be uncertain and anxious about their own personal situation because it hasn't been as easy as turning everything back on. In fact, the level of the deficit that's been left over since March is enormous already. And yes, it does appear to be the recovery, the reopening, rebound does appear to be slowing down over the last couple of months too.
You mentioned the labor market in your answer there. So let's segue to your next article, which is continuing the same story, and it's about the labor market. And the article is called "Who's Negative? The Marginal American worker. And interested listeners and viewers can see that at Alhambra Investments, and it was posted on October 2nd. Jeff, you start out by talking about the two kinds of surveys that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does, and you honed in on labor force participation because September 2020 delivered a remarkable number regarding labor force participation.
Yeah, the labor force level dropped by a significant amount. I believe it was almost 700,000, which, I mean, that's abnormal even in the context of the last dozen years where labor force participation has been the enormous problem in the economy. But 700,000 also in the context of what's supposed to be reopening, it's a huge slap in the face. It's saying, look, the labor market and people in the labor market are supposed to be seeing reopening, rebound, positivities, massive payroll numbers telling them things are going well. And for that many to fall out of the labor force in September suggests that, again, as we've been saying, things might have slowed down way before the finish line all the way back in July. And the perception of that in the labor force itself is that, yeah, maybe there's some validity here. The V is not shaping up as V-like as we would like. And that's why this unusually large drop in the labor force is so, alarming and concerning, because it tells you that at the margins of the U.S. labor market, laborers themselves are alarmed and concerned that they're telling the BLS in such large numbers they're not even looking for work.
Let me pull up the graph so that we can put some numbers to this. So you're showing since 2007 the change in the labor force level, and you've highlighted in red a few of the worst months that we've seen over the last 13 years. But Jeff, wait, before I even get to that, please tell the audience, should we even be seeing a drop in the labor force in a recession? Is that what we always see in recessions?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the labor force participation problem is something that's relatively new. In fact, it's brand new if we consider 2008 forward as a single period in history. Every post-war recession, didn't matter how bad, go back to 1981-82, for example, which was one of the worst up until 2008, the labor force still grew because you don't stop looking for work. Maybe you're unemployed and you go into the unemployment rate, the part, you say to the BLS, I'm unemployed, but you don't stop looking for work because you believe, hey, it's a recession. It'll be over with soon enough and I'll go back to work. I'll find a job. It sucks right now, but I'm still in the labor market because I believe things will come back. That all changed in October of 2008. And again, October of 2008, what happened in October 2008 that would so change the labor market that the labor force itself, the dynamic in the labor force, changed for the first time since the Great Depression? It was a monetary event. It was a major break in the economy because of the global financial crisis. And what happened since then, for the first time, the labor force actually shrank. Since between October 2008 and I believe it was the middle of 2010, almost 2 million people left the labor market. That wasn't because of, they were aging baby boomers who were retiring. It wasn't because of fentanyl got discovered or people were using heroin or all of these ridiculous R-star excuses that economists have tried to come up with ever since to explain the participation problem. It's a macro thing. Global financial crisis back in 2008 broke the economy in a way that we hadn't seen. And so when we see the labor force drop like this, it's laborers and workers in the economy actually telling you, deflation. This is a deflationary macro thing that we're seeing. And so not only has that become more common since 2008, but again, the context of the economic rebound since March, we shouldn't be seeing this. We shouldn't be seeing a sizable decline in the labor force when everything is supposed to be moving rapidly forward. And what that's saying is that, the marginal American worker is thinking, 2008, 2009 again, that this is, there's something wrong here where I'm going to give up even looking for work. I may not be employed, but I'm no longer looking for work either.
And so now I've pulled up the graph showing the change in labor force participation in the United States. Let me just put some numbers to it. The worst month of the 2008-2009 crisis, 767,000 people left the labor force. Then in October 2013, we had 1 million leave due to the government shutdown. I guess they happen all the time. I said the government shutdown, but who knows which one? The October 2013 one. October 2017, a pair of hurricanes arrived back to back, basically, and we saw 830,000 people leave the labor force. Then, during this corona government shutdown crisis, we blew those records out of the water. Okay, makes sense. But as you've been saying, why in the world in September? And what was the September number, Jeff?
I believe it was 695. Almost
695.
700,000. So I mean, it's almost the worst month of 2008, 2009 in September 2020, when the economy is supposed to be rip roaring on its way back. Again, the major overall theme that the V-shaped was easy. We flip the economy off, we flip it right back on, and everybody goes right back to where they were. And over time, especially through the summer, after July and August and September, we're starting to see all of these signs that, number one, it wasn't so easy to turn everything back down. And number two, we're slowing down way, way short of the finish line, which creates all sorts of problems for not just Q4, but really going into 2021. And then, again, Emil, getting back to the data you pulled up from Spain and France and other places in Europe, not just Europe, but Asia too, what governments are starting to realize too is that they had hoped that everything would go right back to normal, but they're starting to prepare for this situation, the more likely situation that it's going to be a long haul.
Jeff, we're running a little bit long in this segment, so let's just wrap it up by talking, if you want to, or you can go macro, which I think you just sort of did right now, but it's one thing to be employed, it's another thing to be working a number of hours, right? And so you brought that up in this article that we're talking about, who's negative, the marginal American worker. And you talked about total hours worked. What did you see there?
Yeah, we're still seeing a large shortfall in hours. So even though if we don't see the same amount of workers have been laid off, some of the workers who are employed aren't working the same number of hours as they used to. And I'm not talking about full-time, part-time. They may still be being paid on a full-time basis, but they're simply not putting in the same number of hours because there's not that number of hours to be worked. And in the BLS report, they have an index for total hours across the private economy. It had contracted year over year at almost 8% rate, which if this had happened in September, this September number had happened during 2008, 2009, it would have been the second worst on record. So you can't have the second worst. I mean, you shouldn't have the second worst number of hours. What would have been the second worst during the Great Recession, during what's supposed to be an amazingly awesome rebound, right? There's something's missing here. What's missing is that it was never going to be as easy turning things back on. And since I think that's really starting to dawn across most of the people, most of the public and most of the governments and even some markets, everybody's starting to focus on, okay, it wasn't so easy. The first V narrative didn't work out. Now what? What comes next?
Joined by Jeff Snider, head of global research for Alhambra Investments. You can find his weekly essay at Real Clear Markets. And today's essay is a fantastic one about digital currencies and about hope and the future and decentralized finance. And I can't even say decentralized finance, but Nick Black of Crypto and Coffee can. And so next week, I think you're going to be on his show and maybe you'll be discussing this article. So everyone read that article and join the Nick Black and Jeff show next week.